Mr. Keith.
My lady, today's witness is Dr. Simon Case.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Dr. Case, thank you very much for coming to help the inquiry at what I know must be an extremely busy time for you.
Could you commence, please, by giving us your full name?
Simon Case.
I'm going to call you Dr. Case, if I may, because you have a doctorate of philosophy from the University of London. You're not a doctor of medicine, to make that plain. Dr. Case, please don't hesitate to ask me to repeat any questions if they're not clear. As is well known, you weren't able to give evidence in the autumn on account of your ill health. Happily, your medical condition has somewhat improved, hence your appearance today. But we will nevertheless be taking regular breaks in the course of your evidence. If you need an additional break, please do not hesitate to tell us.
Thank you.
Before you give your opening statement, which I know you want to do, could you just confirm that you have provided the inquiry with two statements, a corporate statement dated the 25th of January 2023. I think it's a 43-page statement, but it's signed in any event at the end with the usual declaration, 24th of January. And then you provided a second, more personal witness statement dated the 9th of June, again signed on the last page, page 71, by you and containing the usual declaration.
I can confirm. Those are mine.
Thank you very much.
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you, milady, and to your inquiry team for your understanding in rearranging my oral evidence. I recognise that this delay must have been particularly frustrating for the bereaved families who have been waiting so long for answers. I'd like to pay tribute to those who died and to those who lost loved ones during the pandemic. It's so important that through this inquiry we learn the lessons from this period so that we are as prepared as possible for next time. I'd also just finish I'd like to recognise the contribution of the thousands of civil servants and healthcare staff who worked on the response to Covid-19.
Thank you.
Dr. Case, may we commence, please, just by establishing some of the building blocks in terms of your career. You are, of course, currently the Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service. You replaced Mark Sedwell, now Lord Sedwell, as Cabinet Secretary on the 9th of September 2020. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Prior to that point, between the 6th of April 2020 and the 21st of May 2020, had you been a Director General in the Cabinet Office?
That's correct.
In fact, you were on loan to the government from the royal household, and as Director General in the Cabinet Office, you were primarily responsible for coordinating the government's efforts to support non-shielded vulnerable people. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do we take it from that you were not involved in the primary COVID response of February and March 2020?
That's correct.
On the 22nd of May, did you then become formally the second permanent secretary in number 10?
That's correct.
There wasn't, in fact, a first permanent secretary. That is just a curiosity of nomenclature. You were the only permanent secretary at number 10.
That's exactly right, Mr. Keith. It's an oddity of civil service grading structures, which I'm sure my lady doesn't want to hear about.
You're quite right. And you had responsibility for coordinating, in a very general sense, the government's COVID-19 response from central government.
That's correct.
And in the performance of that role, did you come to establish and then lead, because it reported to you, the COVID-19 task force?
That's correct.
Then, as I've said, in September, from the 9th of September onwards, you became Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service. And did you formally at that point rejoin the civil service, having earlier been on loan.
That's exactly right, yes.
When you say in your statement that you had rejoined the civil service, was that because you had formerly carried out a number of roles in the civil service under in the administrations of, I think, Theresa May and David Cameron?
Yeah, correct. I'd been in the civil service, exactly, specifically in number 10 under David Cameron and Theresa May, then went on, left the civil service to go to the royal household and then returned as a civil servant.
May we turn, please, to WhatsApps? It is, I think, understood that you were a prolific user of WhatsApp. You have provided properly to this inquiry a very significant number of WhatsApps which reflect your role in the response to COVID and reflect your views on the performance of the administration which you served. In response to those who might suggest that the WhatsApps are merely tittle-tattle or gossip, would you agree that your WhatsApps talk in blunt terms about the performance of the government and its personalities and its broad strategic direction?
Absolutely, yes. They are very raw, in the moment, human expressions. They're not the whole story, but I recognise they're part of the story. Many of them now require apology for, things that I said and the way I expressed myself. But I recognise that for this inquiry, they are an important part of giving you. I think your expert witness, Mr. Thomas, sort of described them as giving you the context. And I would agree with that.
They are, of course, not the whole record. They must be put into context. But may we approach them on the basis that they do form an important part of the historical record?
Yes. I mean, in the context of this inquiry, yes.
Thank you. Was there a policy in number 10 during your time as permanent secretary or when you first became cabinet secretary relating to the retention or disclosure of WhatsApps?
Not that I remember specifically. The first specific policy relating to WhatsApps that I'm aware of was one that came in March 2021. WhatsApps, of course, would have been covered by a more general approach to, the duties for record keeping and what have you. But I think it was March 2021, as far as I know, that the first specific number 10 policy came in on the retention of WhatsApps.
In your witness statement, you suggest that responsibility for dealing with WhatsApps generally rested with the Prime Minister's principal private secretary, then Martin Reynolds. Did you, as permanent secretary or later cabinet secretary, have any role in the development of the policy?
No. If I may just explain a slight curiosity. Actually, during my time as permanent secretary, I was permanent secretary in number 10 rather than of number 10. The general administration of number 10 was under Martin Reynolds, reporting directly to Mark Sedwell as cabinet secretary. My responsibility was, as you said, the overall COVID response, hence not being involved in the development of that policy as permanent secretary, and not as cabinet secretary either. I understand that policy, the number 10 policy, was developed inside number 10.
All right. Could we have, please, 218356, page 1, which is, in fact, the WhatsApp user policy of March 2021. You'll see halfway down the page, Dr. Case, that the policy suggests that WhatsApps can be used for confirming who is in the office, confirming a time for a meeting, or confirming receipt of a document. So very much technical or mechanistic information. WhatsApp chat should not include any discussion about detailed policy or policy development. And if you find a chat is unexpectedly developing into a more sensitive conversation, you should move the chat onto the number 10 IT system and continue it there. So even in March 2021, and we'll come on to the most recent policy in a moment, there was an expectation that WhatsApp should only be used for relatively anodyne communications, and that if communications were sensitive, they ought to be moved to official IT systems.
Correct.
And it's obvious why that was so, isn't it, Dr. Case? Firstly, it promoted good government and record keeping, and secondly, it provided for necessary accountability. If something sensitive was being debated or views were being expressed, they had to be recorded in the interest of transparency.
Yeah, and obviously the other reason on the number 10, the Prime Minister's location point, that's to do with the security around the Prime Minister.
It's fair to say, isn't it, that to a very large extent, that policy was not followed because, of course, there are a very significant number of WhatsApps from you and many others in which frank and perhaps indiscreet views are expressed on government policy, administrators, politicians, really all the main moving parts of government during the course of this terrible crisis.
Yes, as you say, that's certainly true. I think, I would say it's there. The core sort of real decisions and discussions, I think, were taking place, in meetings, face-to-face meetings or virtual meetings, and being recorded. The inquiry itself has many records of the many meetings and what have you. But it's certainly true that by the time this policy had come in, there was an ingrained way of working.
You yourself expressed concern about the Prime Minister's own use of WhatsApps, because in a WhatsApp exchange, ironically, with Jack Doyle in November 2020, you discussed whether or not it was true to say that the Prime Minister wasn't making government decisions, in fact, via WhatsApp.
Yeah, there were a number of times, I think particularly as Cabinet Secretary, where I intervened to try and get serious discussions off WhatsApps. The inquiry has access to those moments where, I'm saying, can we get things off WhatsApp, and can we make sure we're having proper discussions with the right people in the room? That's true.
The then Prime Minister.
The then Prime Minister, yes. Sorry, you're quite right, my lady.
Could we have, please, 303-252, page 26. In April of 2021, thank you very much, at 21:13:48, right at the top of the page, Dr. Case, who the hell has briefed the Times and Telegraph that I advised the Prime Minister to change his phone number? I don't think this is true, by the way. I certainly don't remember ever having told him this. We've all told him to get off WhatsApp. Why was it necessary to tell him to get off WhatsApp? What was the danger of him, the Prime Minister, using WhatsApp?
I think in this particular context, there were two issues that had come up. One, that he, the Prime Minister, was sort of frustrated that lots of people had been sort of contacting him from outside government on WhatsApp, and was expressing frustration, to which the answer was, well, get off don't give people your telephone number and get off WhatsApp. And the other one is to do with making sure that, I don't want to sound like I'm a Luddite, because obviously, as you've said, I use prolific user of WhatsApp myself, but we have to make sure that serious issues are addressed in a, I don't want to say formulaic or bureaucratic way, because that sort of makes me sound like the thing that many people will think I am, sort of too Sir Humphrey-ish. It's just on important issues, trying to resolve them on WhatsApp, not being clear that you've got all the right expertise on that group or what have you. There's dangers to decision-making.
Well, it's fairly obvious, isn't it? Important decisions need to be debated in the correct structure and with a proper, appropriate degree of transparency.
Yeah.
And if you make major decisions by WhatsApp, people will never know that you have done. That's the bottom line.
Yes, I mean, the record keeping, is an important part of it. It's not the only part of it, but it is an important part of it.
Coming forward to the current policy, Dr. Case, 421804, there is now a policy on using non-corporate communication channels for government business. And this applies both to corporate phones and to personal phones. It is concerned with non-corporate channels, so using WhatsApp at work or at home. Could we please look at paragraph 14 on page 2, because this identifies the sort of information which is required not to be put onto WhatsApp, or at least if it is, to be moved thereafter onto an official channel, a government system. It's called significant government information, which materially impacts the direction of a piece of work or that gives evidence of a material change to a situation. If I may observe, that's a wonderful piece of prose. Could you help us with it? In particular, can Her Ladyship be assured that the application of that policy does mean that the types of WhatsApps that you sent and which you received, which commented bluntly and frankly on the performance of ministers and officials and on the merits of government decision-making, would fall within this policy, would be regarded as significant government information? Because defining it as something merely that impacts the direction of a piece of work or which gives evidence of material change to a situation might not, in fact, encompass the sort of WhatsApps which you've agreed need to be recorded.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very fair challenge. I don't think the plain reading of that and the sort of normal government practice would cover this material that I think is important to this inquiry that gives you the context. I think this sort of significant government information is a formulation language that's been around for quite a long time that flows from sort of the responsibilities we have to retain information. I think generally the sorts of things that we're talking about would not be material to that sort of more personal colour is not the sort of material that would be kept because it hasn't been kept in the past, whether it was on WhatsApp or, it's not the sort of material that appears in the Public Records Office, for example, from previous administrations. And I'm sure that's something that you'll want to consider, my lady.
So there is an issue, therefore, as to whether or not this policy is tight enough in terms of obligating the recording or transfer to government systems of important expressions of interest and of observations and commentary on WhatsApp.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly, the sort of material that the inquiry's got and is used, and I'm sure we'll discuss it, is, when you go through history and previous crises, it's the sort of material that you would only have got through diaries and that sort of thing from individuals who would have taken part. As I say, it wouldn't have occurred. I'm somebody who spent 3 very happy years as a PhD student down at the Kew Public Records Office, and I can tell you the colour of the sort that you've got, and I'm sure we'll discuss, isn't there. The best you get is sort of a handwritten note from Churchill or Clement Attlee in the margins. You don't get this. You don't get the sort of material that this inquiry has got through WhatsApps.
Turning to your own personal position, you've provided to the inquiry, obviously, a great deal of material. You've also provided, through your team, a number of threads of one-to-one messages between yourself and others. But you say in your statement that you are unable to provide some group messages to which you were part because you accidentally deleted them.
Yeah, that's correct. We at the start identified 39, I think, WhatsApp strings that I'd got that were relevant. I've submitted 30 to the inquiry. I think it's over 600 pages. But 9 were lost in the process of transferring them to hand over to the inquiry. I can only apologise for that, my lady. It's entirely my error. As I said, we offered to recover this material for the other participants. I offered to do that, but I actually understand the inquiry has got this material from other participants itself, so I haven't needed to. As I say, I can only apologise. It's my own idiocy and nothing else.
We're bound to ask, Dr. Case, why was the Cabinet Secretary himself or herself attempting to export and preserve group messages from their own phone? I mean, presumably you have people who can help you with that or technical support. And why did you end up deleting only some groups?
I'd say, honestly, I was trying to just get this done as part of preparing my witness material. We have an IT department. Lesson learned. I should not ever try this myself again.
During the course of the COVID pandemic, did you become aware that WhatsApp messages would be likely to be needed to be retained and then provided to an inquiry?
I mean, yes. I mean, I think we were all clear that all sorts of records would be kept. You know, I remember advising the Prime Minister early on in, I think it was the autumn or even the late summer of 2020, that there should be a public inquiry. So yes, absolutely.
On INQ document 265619, you WhatsApped Mr. Johnson's Principal Private Secretary, Martin Reynolds. It's page 68. On the 20th of December 2021, 181319,
Yeah.
the last entry, Simon Case. The Prime Minister is mad if he doesn't think his WhatsApps will become public via a COVID inquiry. But he was clearly not in the mood for that discussion tonight. We'll have that battle in the new year. Yeah. So had it been the former Prime Minister's position that he didn't believe that his WhatsApps would reach the public domain? I
cannot honestly tell you I remember the exact context of this. I can't quite work out why we were discussing that, why we were discussing this issue at this particular point, I'm afraid. But clearly the Prime Minister said something that I'm reacting to.
Imran Shafi, who was another of the former Prime Minister's private secretary, told this inquiry that you'd asked him to remove, in accordance with the policy, we presume, his work-related messages or WhatsApp messages from his phone.
Yeah.
He says, however, that he wasn't told to keep them or to provide the Cabinet Office with a record of any substantive or significant work-related messages. Do you recall him not being told to keep records?
No, I don't think I can specifically remember the conversation with Mr. Shafi. I had the discussion with a number of colleagues, during this period in which my line was a standard one, which was if you've got stuff on your personal phone and you're leaving, then obviously you shouldn't be taking that material with you, but that you should record this all in a notebook or ask for confirmation that it had all been recorded in a notebook.
On a related point, one of the core participants has raised the issue of, based upon something said by Priti Patel MP in her Rule 9 statement, of whether there was proper record keeping of the discussions of the ministerial quad in particular. Do you recall the record keeping system for that particular body?
So the quad was largely active in the first wave, so sort of before I was there. When the quad, so the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Health Secretary and the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster met, I don't think it was particularly frequently. They would be recorded, I believe, via a private secretary record.
Is that a private secretary keeping notes? Keeping
notes should be in a notebook and then should be in an email, which would be distributed to those as a record. But usually actually mainly to get people to take action. And standard practice in number 10 is that those, or certainly in my time as a private secretary, there was that you would copy those readouts to the people that we call the duty clerks or PM posts, so that could go onto the file, the record that they keep of all of the correspondence and material relating to the Prime Minister.
And in relation to your approach to the inevitable inquiry,
Yeah.
Sir Patrick Vallance in his diary, and you've referred to the importance of diaries, and perhaps Sir Patrick Vallance is the modern day Johnson or Crossman. He says in his diaries that in November 2020, you said to him that any inquiry should go on for a decade or more, that you wanted someone like Lord Savile to chair it so as to keep it going forever. And I must ask you, did you say that to Sir Patrick Vallance?
I don't remember saying that at this time. I remember real concern because Chris, Patrick, a number of colleagues knew that I was advising the Prime Minister that I thought there'd have to be a full public inquiry, that they were really concerned about when we would start it and how it would operate. You know, they were, I think, particularly worried that we'd start it during the pandemic and, you know, it would make life very difficult for them to keep doing it. That's what I remember the context. I do not remember saying such thing, but obviously, you know, they're Patrick's words rather than mine.
Turning to your role as the Director General in the Cabinet Office and the steps you took to ensure that the interests of non-shielded vulnerable groups were properly protected. When you arrived in office in April of 2020, you expressed considerable concern to Helen McNamara, from whom the inquiry has heard, concerning the atmosphere in the Cabinet Office, concerning unnecessary debates about whom you should be reporting to, and about the behaviour. Could we have, please, 303-253 at page 1? This is a WhatsApp thread dated the 3rd of April 2020. And without spending too much time on it, we can see, for example, in the third entry, 2143, Simon Case, the slides don't really say anything about how we're actually fixing various problems. 2151, 29, Helen McNamara talks about the bitching and the egos and sheep and goats and people are scared. And at 2154, crisis and pygmies equals toxic behaviours. The crisis is obviously a reference to Covid-19. Your reference to pygmies, was that an observation on the ability of individuals in the Cabinet Office and Number 10?
I can't remember precisely what it is, but I think that would be a fair conclusion to draw. I can't tell you for sure, but
Well, it must have
that's
been.
a plain reading.
And you were concerned about the effect of that combination, that the behaviour of individuals in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office was toxic.
Yeah.
And please explain to us why that mattered. Were you just concerned because it's an unpleasant thing to occur on your watch? Or was it that the behaviour and the performance of people at the central government was materially impacting upon the government's response to this crisis? It was affecting governance.
Could I just expand a little bit on what I saw when I arrived to sort
Please.
of help? I worked in Downing Street and the Cabinet Office for, you know, big chunks of my career before I went off to work for the Royal Household. And as is always true at sort of the centre of power, I think probably everywhere around, it, you know, doesn't all, you know, there are always pretty big egos and there are always things to manage. But I'd worked there through, in either Number 10 or the Cabinet Office, through a whole range of crises. I should say nothing the size and scale of COVID. I don't think any of us, I don't think any peacetime government had ever dealt with anything like it. But through thick and thin, through egos which are always there, there was a real sense of team spirit, trying to sort of work efficiently and effectively. I I found reading Helen McNamara's both written evidence and oral evidence quite difficult, just as I found as preparation for this, rereading this material, quite emotionally difficult, because it reminded me of quite how difficult it was. That good people were working incredibly hard in impossible circumstances with choices where it seemed there was never a right answer. But that lack of sort of team spirit, the difficult atmosphere, we are trying to run everything from the centre of government, despite trying to run the response to a global pandemic. Duplication of effort, overlapping meetings, kind of good people were just being smashed to pieces. That's what I saw.
We will look at some of those references in your WhatsApps later, Dr. Case, but you refer to people being smashed about and systems being smashed. But your reference there to, in this particular WhatsApp, to pygmies, was not a physical or an anthropological reference. You were referring there to the performance or the ability of individuals, because plainly you're making a different point to the one you've just made now, which is that the crisis was so great it would have overwhelmed anybody. You're referring to the ability of individuals. That was the problem, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I failed to answer the second part of your point, which was about how did it actually affect people outside. I can't answer this question with the clarity that I'm sure you'd like. What I know is that it felt that decision-taking was inefficient and sort of more difficult than it had to be, and it was sort of more unhappy. Did it actually lead to decisions being delayed as a result of those behaviours? I'm not sure it did. I think it made it inefficient and sometimes ineffective in things. But did it, did we lock down later or unlock later because of behaviours? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we did.
Did the nature of the individuals and personalities in Number 10, the Cabinet Office, lead to a more dysfunctional and sclerotic administration, putting aside the big ticket issues, lockdowns and non-pharmaceutical interventions, on which obviously decisions had to be made eventually in one shape or form? But the day-to-day administration, did it become anarchic, dysfunctional, and extremely difficult?
So it was definitely dysfunctional and it was difficult. Oddly enough, it wasn't. Sclerotic isn't quite the right word. If anything, the problem is it was almost too dynamic. It was difficult to settle on a course of action and be sure that the course of action would be consistent. I think it's sort of almost the opposite of sclerosis.
Well, you referred to flip-flopping, trolleying,
Yeah.
and the well-known, and it's been said repeatedly in evidence, inability of the former Prime Minister to make a decision and stick to it.
Yeah, I mean, that material's there. Those are, examples that I obviously now deeply regret of expressing my in-the-moment frustrations with the former Prime Minister. Actually, I think particularly I didn't know the Prime Minister very well at all, in fact, barely, when I started working in Downing Street. So I didn't really understand how he took decisions. I mean, after, I would say sort of into 2021, I thought I'd started to get the rhythm of it. His style is very much wanting the debate to play out in front of him. Competition for ideas and views, I think, is really how he made decisions. He really wants to test and see, perhaps sometimes in a way that actually lawyers would recognise, in a way that lots of others don't, of that, hearing the debate playing out before taking a view. I think so. I also think I didn't really understand at that time how personally and politically difficult. That's not a big P politics. I'm talking about how particularly I'm sure we'll come on to the details of the second lockdown and the unlocking, I don't think I really understood how at quite a deep ideological level the Prime Minister found the mass locking up of the population, the harms. He was always really thinking, particularly focusing about children and education, the sort of the damage, as he saw it, that was being done to society through those big decisions on the lockdowns. I don't think I understood at the time, in a way that I do now, quite how personally difficult that was for him, as well as the style, because his clarity of thought and, I mean, Boris Johnson's sort of strengths, well, he's one of, great communicator. He's one of those people who can stand at a podium and make people that he's never met, doesn't have a lot of common, he doesn't have a huge amount of common with, make them think that he's articulating their hopes and their dreams and their fears. He's a great communicator. That clarity, that ideology and that communication, when it came, I know this is off topic, sorry, my lady, but on things like the vaccine rollout, which I know you'll come on to, his ability to sort of see with absolute clarity what needed to be done, how we communicated it, was in stark contrast to, I think, the difficulty that he found during the summer and the autumn. And totally off topic, but on subjects like Ukraine, the way that he could see with absolute clarity on a values base what was the right thing to do to support Ukrainians against Putin and galvanise sort of global action is a good example of, that he could do things with absolute clarity. So there was something about that period in particular which I think he found particularly difficult.
In essence, would you agree that the incredibly difficult decisions which he had to make, and he personally had to make, affected him so viscerally and gave rise to such internal, agonizing debate that it had an impact upon the proper management of the system of which he was, of course, the head.
I was the sort of technocrat employed to connect political will to administrative action across the system. So, it was real frustration that was being acted by the person. I was the one who had to take what he and his ministerial team were deciding and go and tell other members of the COVID task force, tell the rest of Whitehall, talk to Simon Stevens at the NHS and say, this is the direction we're going and this is what we've got to do. So I found it incredibly frustrating that on one day I thought, right, okay, we've got this. I can safely now talk to my colleagues and say this is the direction we're going in and we've taken this decision. Let's now plan on this basis. And then, well, you can see it. You've got the material. The inquiry's talked about it a lot already. The following day it was like, well, we're now somewhere else. That was really difficult as a sort of technocrat to as the gearbox trying to connect the Prime Minister to the system. Of course, I was frustrated. I wish we'd had the decision on day one and we'd stuck to it. But as I said, I think that's how people like me want the world to work. That isn't how the world works. All Prime Ministers have their own ways of taking decisions. Some Prime Ministers, go through endless detail, and if anything, their problem is they scrutinise everything and then they delay the decision because they just want, endless amounts of information. That read your diaries again, they're in there. Each Prime Minister has their own approach to doing it, and as I say, in my job, I found it very frustrating. But I just don't think I really understood how difficult he was finding it personally.
But the impact wasn't confined, of course, to you, Dr. Case.
No, sorry.
There was an impact upon the proper performance of the machinery of government.
Yeah.
Is that the nub of it?
Of course.
Yes.
Sorry, I agree with you, but sorry, I was rambling. Sorry.
No, it wasn't at all, Dr. Case. It really wasn't. Can we now look at non-shielded vulnerable groups?
Yeah.
In a paper dated the 3rd of April, 83379, mapping of non-shielded vulnerable groups, we can see there that you set out, I think this was may not have been your paper. I think it was a paper presented to the General Public Services MIG.
I have spotted this as well. I think we need to go away and check actually whether that date's correct, because this looks too early for this articulation of the problem to me. I'm wondering if it should actually read the 3rd of May. But I'm sure we can go on to the point. It's just, I think between us, we should actually do what we can to check whether it's in fact the correct date on that paper.
By all means, thank you. Do you recollect this paper? I mean, is the reason why you believe it might have been May was because you recall contributing to it or
Yeah, I think
seeing
it's late April or May. Now, the trouble is this is 4 years ago. It could be a memory of being shown this on arrival, but I'm sure we can get to the key point without worrying about the date.
The point about this document is that it attempted to identify target vulnerable groups. So if you look over the page at page 2, you can see that specific concerns are expressed regarding socially vulnerable people isolating at home, vulnerable children and free school meal households, individuals with no access to public funds, rough sleepers, and so on. This is dated possibly April, possibly May. There is no doubt whatsoever that the government turned to identify who vulnerable groups consisted of and what had to be done to protect them in the teeth of this crisis. A lockdown, however, had already been imposed. It was imposed on the 23rd of March. Why was this consideration, necessary consideration to vulnerable groups, not being addressed or raised earlier? Why was this work not done at the time that the decision-making was going on as to whether or not a lockdown should be applied at all?
I honestly I can't answer that one because I wasn't around. What I remember is, in around this time, then Cabinet Secretary Mark Sebel getting in touch with me and saying, there'd been this huge focus on the vulnerable group, what became known as shielding, and I think it was a combination of the then Cabinet Secretary and Michael Gove as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who'd really sort of said, hold on a minute, we haven't done enough thinking about this. So my belief is by being asked to come in and do this, it looks like an admission that not enough had been done early on. But I honestly, it's outside my personal experience as to what discussions took place in the first lockdown.
But certainly when you took over the position that you did in the Cabinet Office, there was no pre-existing consideration of these vulnerable groups in existence that you could have had recourse to or did have recourse to, and that is why the General Public Services, MIG, and why you were obliged to be addressing vulnerabilities in April and May. Bluntly, it had not been thought of before then.
I think there was more thinking than I realised. There is the inquiry has it. I certainly put it in my witness statement as an exhibit. An email that I wrote to Michael Gove and Mark Sedwell after my first few days in post, saying actually, I'd started off thinking there wasn't a lot going here. Actually, when you talk to departments, there probably is a bit more work going on. So, for example, DEFRA were doing the work on how to get food to vulnerable, and they were thinking about how to work with supermarkets to spread not just to shielding groups but to other vulnerable groups, how we could work with supermarkets to get more food delivery slots for them. DFE, I mustn't do that, the Department for Education, obviously was thinking about vulnerable children and, in particular about trying to make sure that they were in school as they could have been. What I think was going on, though, is that was sort of happening in departments and probably maybe wasn't being given all the effort it needed to. So when I arrived, there was a standard Cabinet Office coordination job, but then a challenge of how to articulate what we were already doing and then identify what the gaps were. The gap between needs and provision, sorry to talk in sort of technocratic sort of ways, but citizens' needs, here's the provision, is there a gap in the middle? That was really the task as I came in.
There are ample references in the material, Dr. Case, to you observing that there was too much siloed government. So different departments were working in tandem and there was insufficient communication. But also that a great deal of the practical steps, the necessary practical steps to assist vulnerable people were being taken out with central government by charities,
Yes.
local authorities, supermarkets, volunteers. And so, on the one hand, central government wasn't performing its function adequately, and on the other hand, there was a distinct limit as to what it could do. Is that the nub of it?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, this is an example almost to me, the point I made earlier about the centre trying to do too much. And almost there is this long-standing challenge, a cultural challenge at the centre. This goes back, it's not recent, it's always through the decades, read the history books, it's all there. That sort of, if the Prime Minister can't see it, it must not be happening. And actually, that's not really how government works. A vast amount of stuff happens that Prime Ministers don't see day in, day out. Of course, they couldn't. And in particular, you know, one of the particular issues around vulnerability, as you say, is a vast amount of the provision was being done at local authority level and through the charity sector. So actually, through my time on the non-shielded vulnerable programme, I spent a lot of time talking to the then head of the British Red Cross, who was the chair of the voluntary sector emergency response group. Again, just trying to understand what charities working at a very local level were hearing about what was working, what wasn't working, getting that information back to us so we could then work with charities and local authorities to get that provision in place.
Can you recall to what extent the ethnicity of non-shielded vulnerable people came up for debate, and also to what degree, as you were beginning to look at the needs of vulnerable people, it was understood that the pandemic had hit ethnic minorities far harder than other sectoral groups?
Honestly, I think this is one of the things that not enough attention was paid to early on. I think my memory is that the questions about ethnic minority groups really well and truly came onto the sort of top tier radar, possibly in sort of May, probably actually June, I think, 2020. I think there was a Public Health England study done, and that galvanised quite a lot of action from that point on. We didn't get in particular the communications and provision of testing right during the autumn in sort of certain communities, and we did actually learn the hard lessons for when it came onto vaccine rollout about how to understand the needs, how to communicate, who are the voices that need to be encouraging certain communities to come forward. But I think it was a slow learning process.
And then turning to another considerable difficulty that you encountered, that there was then the issue of data and analysis.
Yeah.
And at the bottom of this page, on page 2, we can see that in your recommended actions, or in the recommended actions, what was identified as being needed included cross-government analysts with relevant experience in understanding this cohort, that is to say, the cohort of non-shielded vulnerable people, to ensure data and analysis to quantify and refine focus on target groups and identify essential services. Stripping out, if you'll forgive me, the perhaps the somewhat bureaucratic language, there was a shortage of data in central government to inform you as to what, in practice, the needs of these people were and how they could be met. You just didn't really know what was going on the ground. That's the bottom line.
Spot on.
Yeah. It's obvious from the material, Dr. Case, that it understandably took some time to get the data available. And it's obvious from your witness statement that a great deal of work was done to get the data streams up and running. You had the dashboard.
Yeah.
You had the setting up of the Downing Street Data Service,
Yeah.
10DS.
Yeah.
a great deal of work was done by the Office of National Statistics and Syrian Diamond. There were COVID surveys, in fact, a mass of data, eventually. When were you able to report to the Prime Minister that you had adequate data in order to be able to start understanding the needs of socially vulnerable people?
Oh, I would say that's really into the autumn, I would say.
That, if I may say so, accords with other evidence that my lady has heard concerning the paucity of data at the beginning of the pandemic and the inadequacy of the data streams. Do you happen to know whether or not today the structures and the building blocks remain for the speedy provision of data in the event of a comparable crisis?
Yes, very much so. Alongside the lessons that I'm sure my lady will identify, we've obviously been identifying lessons inside government as we go, and data. Sorry, I'm a bit of a data obsessionist. We've created a sort of national situation centre. Sorry, again, all these long, slightly odd titles. The Joint Data Analysis Centre, and crucially, the Office for National Statistics and what we now call our Levelling Up Department are working to get us, sorry again for the language, much more granular level, much more detailed level, to try and not use that word, about what's happening at local levels, sort of day in, day out, so that we can understand. It's not perfect, it's like sort of painting the Forth Bridge, you have to keep going back over it. But we've invested an awful lot in getting much more micro-level data about what's going on in the economy, in society, and all that sort of thing. Much broader data sets or ranges of data than previously we were collecting.
In an email in May, I won't take you to it, you were in fact, as you say, still reporting on the lack of data. You said meaningful reporting about what is happening on the ground is rare, and the upward communication of meaningful data at a regional or national level is even rarer. So central government does not have the information it requires.
Yep.
So that's a very good summary of the position in the summer.
Yep.
Another issue, structural issue, concerned the, again, language that perhaps you'll explain to us, the interdependencies across departments within central government. If we look at 83541, which is the dashboard for the 6th of May 2020, and page 4.
Slightly foreboding. I don't know why we made it look like that.
Yes, the
Sorry.
the black background looks rather forbidding. If you look at page 4, we can see there figures on how many are vulnerable, how the government's performing, and obviously there are very sensible questions being posed and answered on the face of this document. You were concerned with the hospitalisation rate, who was clinically vulnerable. You were concerned with the delivery of food packages, the delivery of care to the clinically extremely vulnerable, and so on. So obviously all self-evidently highly worthy and sensible.
I would just, the thing to point out, I think this was one of the areas where the data was most advanced on the clinically extremely vulnerable group, because obviously they'd sort of been working with GPs and whatnot to identify. I know the cohort was refined for later periods, but I mean, even though there are gaps in this data, this is one of the areas where it was better than most.
Yes, because this, in fact, this deals with shielded people, and shielded people, or the position of the clinically extremely vulnerable and those who required shielding, had, of course, been directly addressed at the time that the lockdown decision had been taken.
Yep.
And in summary, is this right? During the week between the 16th and the 23rd of March, when the final decision was taken to impose the lockdown, part of the time lapse, what was taken up with considering the needs of those who would require shielding and putting into place the practical measures for their protection?
Look, I wasn't there at the time, as it were. I've read the same evidence you have, and that accords with my understanding.
So yes, shielding was shielded people were ahead of the game in terms of the delivery of services and protection. But right at the bottom of the page, you will see, in answer to the question, what are the barriers to progress? Decisions are not aligned where there are interdependencies across departments. Is that a way of saying that central government departments were just not speaking sufficiently to each other, and there was no body in place to bring together the administrators and officials to talk about the reality of what needed to be done?
Yeah, that's your ability to translate Whitehall speak is very good.
And was it in part because of that you drove the institution of the COVID task force, so that there would be a unitary body, a single body, where everybody could speak to each other face to face and make the necessary decisions?
My experience of this programme was absolutely one of the key inspirations behind COVID task force.
The COVID task force was, however, not instituted until the late summer.
Correct.
Why did it take so long?
I'm not sure I can answer that one. As soon as I got asked to do the permanent secretary job, coordinating all of this, it was pretty much my first recommendation. Why was it not done before that? I mean, perhaps it's just one of those things where everybody had been working flat out, the structures had been set up, and as it were, a fresh pair of eyes, it's easier for a new person to see, why don't we just do this rather than that? But I can't, I'm afraid, give you a clear answer.
And as the months rolled by in the Cabinet Office, from the beginning of April, when you joined, through April, May and June, was there any significant reduction in the degree of chaos and lack of understanding as to what needed to be done? And I ask you that because, of course, I'm about to show you some of your emails, WhatsApps with Helen McNamara.
It took a long time. It took us many months to get to, a better place. I think Simon Ridley in his evidence said to you, the COVID task force was better than what had gone before, but it wasn't perfect, and it took us a long time to sort of announcing a task force has some effect, but it actually takes quite a long time for the patterns of human behaviour and ways of working. It was a new institution in government, working across government. It takes time to establish those relationships and get it to where it got to. It took.
Sorry. Carry on. You'll finish your answer.
No.
Can I raise with you one of my hobby horses, which, as you may know, is the use of plain English?
Sorry.
No. It's just that I've always argued that the use of what you've called, was it Whitehallese or civil service, that it obscures communication. And one of the things, as I read this document that we have up on screen, shielded, clinically extremely vulnerable, because I don't understand it because of the use of Whitehallese, I wonder if the use of that language obscures your message, and therefore people who would have to take the decision to put in place a task force are not getting the impact of the message because it's got these silly expressions. Sorry to use the word silly.
Well, I think it's a very... Each profession ends up as part of its own anthropology, developing its own language and ways of working, and sometimes they do exactly what you say. I mean, I think lots of us who are civilians who've spent a lot of our careers working with colleagues in the military sort of look at the military language and say, what on earth? Why don't you just say that's, dropping a bomb or something? Why are we talking about effect? What does that mean? I think you're absolutely right, and it's probably something that we should reflect more on, is whether the institutional language takes away the humanity. And I think it's sort of something that Helen McNamara, I thought, rather powerfully brought out, is all the way through. How do you connect decision makers in a very human way to the outcomes of the decisions that they're taking.
I don't think it's just the lack of humanity. I think it obscures the message. And if you're trying to get a message across to decision makers, who are the politicians, don't you have to have a clarity of message?
Yeah. Well, certainly many politicians are in the same place as you, milady, of complaining about, could you just tell me what you mean?
Odd that, really. Sorry, Mr. Keith.
I was only going to observe that I think Dr. Case is itching to say something about the anthropological disadvantages of the legal profession, but he couldn't quite bring himself to say anything.
One of the things my counsel advised me not to go, and I'm already making him uncomfortable, I know.
Milady, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, of course. And I think we're going to have more than one break, so we're going to have 10-minute breaks. Is that right?
Thank you.
Right. So 11:10, please.
All rise.
Mr. Keith.
Dr. Case, in late April, you had a series of very frank exchanges with Helen McNamara concerning the workings of government. Could we have 303-253 at page 5, please? Thank you very much. I just want to identify some of the broad strands or themes from these multiple exchanges, Dr. Case. At 11:36:39, there's a reference by you to Lord Sedwell believing that a minister was required to be put in charge, obviously for the purposes of political accountability and also because in Whitehall that tends to promote speedier and more direct action. At 13:06:01, she refers to the different responsibilities of departments and ministers, the maddening nature of the proportion of time spent on process and organograms as opposed to actual work. At 13:42, you talk about the chaos, too many programs, the tension, that the system is being run as a communications forum rather than as a system for taking decisions. At 13:18:46, at the bottom of the page, decisions in Whitehall don't equal facts on the ground. Not enough people at the centre know this. The lack of vision and patience. Over the page. 13:20:15, as you were saying earlier, you recognise that what is actually required to be done is in fact being done by people in the voluntary and charitable sector, local authority or individual police officer, GP, supermarket worker. And it's all very distant from, of course, number 10. 13:25:28, the endless talking. 13:28:48, shocking how strategy advice is being developed. The appalling sight of the realisation, in essence, of a lack of evidence-based government. And Helen McNamara talks of, in response, the arrogance, the waste, the contempt for Parliament. 13:18:18. 13:38:18, right at the bottom of the page, the lack of transparency. And in your concurrent WhatsApp messages with Mr. Hancock, I won't take you to them, you refer to the fact that you had found the Cabinet Office to be, to use your words, a totally dysfunctional mess. So just dividing out, please, some of those themes. Firstly, the reference to too many departments. In hindsight, was the government machinery simply inadequately efficient? It just wasn't lean enough. And it took time, as you've said, in order to change the structures, to change the supertanker of government in a more appropriate direction.
Yes. I mean, look, it's not because people weren't working very hard. They were very talented people. Clearly, Helen and I were having a particularly sort of down day when we were having this exchange. But yes, this is what the COVID task force was supposed to help fix.
The arrogance and the waste. The arrogance appears to be a reflection on the individual personalities. It's a reference to the people. And bearing in mind what you've already said, and you've said it in your statement, and you've said it publicly, by and large, individually, people in Number 10, the Cabinet Office, gave their very best. They gave their all in the service of their country and in the opposition of the pandemic and to fight the pandemic. But their work was to a considerable extent undone by the behaviour or the lack of ability of some individuals who were in a position to make a difference and who failed them. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, but I mean, these are collective problems. I mean, these are Helen and I whinging about things that we also had a responsibility to fix. It's not, there's an easy version of this, that this was all down to just a few people, but we were all in this together.
SPADs.
Yeah.
Did this system for special political advisors help or ultimately hinder the promotion of good government in the face of the crisis?
Actually, I don't think it hindered. I don't think it's a sort of structural issue around special advisors. I mean, I don't think you've heard. I know you've received written evidence, I think, from Henry Cook, who was during my time in Number 10, and then as cabinet secretary. Henry Cook was the lead special advisor for COVID. Absolutely outstanding, long experience of government, really good at working with officials and helping us translate the politics and the political will and the direction into the action that's required. So I don't think there's a structural issue around special advisors in COVID. It's my view.
It was an individual issue.
Yeah, I mean, there were rubbing points, and I'm sure we'll come on to those.
Yes. Well, we can probably address them shortly. There is ample material to indicate that Mr. Cummings, he's described as a genius by many people in government.
Yeah.
His ability to be able to strategize and to see the problems before they arose is notable. But you and Helen McNamara speak repeatedly of the culture of fear that he generated, and also the chaos and the unwillingness of other people to work with him as a result. Is that a fair summary?
Yes. I mean, if I may add, as some people have said, you've described that he had qualities that obviously really important to the senior politicians in a number of guises that he worked with. As other people have said, he could be very challenging. He was particularly challenging to senior officials who he didn't think sort of were up to the mark. He was very challenging to senior people. Actually, my view, my probably experience was his reputation was worse than the reality, I think, in the end. It was my experience. I think there are two important things to note. One is actually when I arrived in Downing Street as the permanent secretary to do COVID, actually from that point, Mr. Cummings wasn't particularly involved in the COVID response for the first couple of months. As incidents started to sort of certainly flatten off in mid to late July, he started to become much more involved. He took a particular sort of responsibility and interest in the mass testing and moonshot programme. But actually, a lot of the descriptions that you've had, and some are really difficult from Helen and her report, actually didn't particularly. The worst of it didn't actually match my experience of coming into Number 10 working on COVID.
But that's your personal take.
Yes.
As the head of the civil service, ultimately, and as Cabinet Secretary, you noted in WhatsApp messages with her and others that there was an actual culture of fear.
Yeah, there was.
That people wouldn't speak up in meetings because they were concerned about his potential response. You yourself described individuals, and you were obviously referring to him as these people round the Prime Minister, these animals in number 10.
Feral, I think.
Feral.
I actually think
you referred directly to the practical consequences, which is that people wouldn't speak when they were obliged to speak, and people wouldn't come and work in Downing Street despite being approached.
Yep, so that's all true. I think the really difficult thing was that in particular there were very bad relationships between Mr Cummings, Lord Lister, who you've heard from, Martin Reynolds and Stuart Glassborough. Those were all the people who actually sat, by and large, outside the Prime Minister's office directly, you know, the desks outside the Prime Minister's door. In number 10, that group would have been seen as sort of the top of the shop. And the relationships between Mr Cummings and the other three were poor. And that did not help at all.
May we please be absolutely clear about this? In this very same WhatsApp string, in fact, we need to look at it, but page 10, you yourself referred to somebody who'd been asked to join number 10 or a particular aspect of.
Yes.
I won't say which aspect because that would give the game away.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And that particular person said the setup in number 10 is too mad to touch.
Yes.
And he wouldn't or she wouldn't come and join.
Correct.
And you yourself say good people were being put off because it's such a rat's nest.
Yep, that's all correct.
This is the permanent secretary in number 10 describing his own organisation as a rat's nest, and one which is putting off able people joining you who were required to join on account of the pandemic.
That's correct.
Right.
It took, I mean, we did get very good people to come in to the COVID task force, but that ended up being quite a separate entity with its own sort of culture and ways of working from the rest of number 10.
Another thread is cabinet governance. On 303-253, page 9, on the 10th of May, 9:43, 29, so in the middle of the page, Helen McNamara says, the Prime Minister doesn't believe in cabinet government and departments, and neither does Dominic Cummings. That may have been putting it too high, and obviously everyone will bear in mind what you said about the frank but perhaps unfortunate phraseology of WhatsApps. But were you concerned that, as Helen McNamara told her ladyship, cabinet governance was being circumvented and that the cabinet itself was not being given, and I'm quoting from her statement, the full scientific picture or able to properly be part of accountable decision-making?
Yeah. This issue around the way cabinet is treated is not unique to this problem. Look at the Chilcot report around Iraq and many others around cabinet government not being the way it's described by the ideals of Hennessy and Jennings and people like this and that sort of thing. It's not been like that for quite a long time. I think, but we did take steps to fix this. So there was a particular issue, I think, around cabinet not being talked through the decisions, not being given access to the data that we fixed by making sure there were regular weekly sessions with Chris and Patrick and the data team to try and fix this. So yes, I was concerned and we took steps.
Meetings between whom? Cabinet and Sir Chris
Correct.
Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance?
We would do, I think it was weekly, we did data sessions with them so that they and our data people could talk cabinet through what was happening. Basically a dashboard session for the cabinet, and they could ask all the questions they wanted about what was going on, the science, the latest position.
But in terms of accountable decision-making, is it not the position that even by the time of the second lockdown and the third lockdown in January, that the core decision-making was taking place in number 10 still by the Prime Minister and and particularly by Covid-19.
Yeah.
And Cabinet was, to a certain extent, brought into the decision-making loop, generally only after Covid-19 had made the ultimate decision.
Yep, that's correct. The decisions were taken in Covid-19 or Covid-19, which they were entitled to do. They had the status of full cabinet committees, so that is cabinet responsibility for decision-making delegated to those cabinets. So there's nothing, there might be something in terms of the diversity of views, etc.,
yes,
but it is procedurally perfectly normal for cabinet committees to take decisions. What was unusual was that those cabinet committee decisions were then actually taken to cabinet. It was more, I would say, cabinet discussed the decision that had been taken, people raised points, sometimes changed things at the margins, but that's how it worked.
And you've just referred to it, the absence of diversity. You and Helen McNamara and others were concerned that on the one hand, Cabinet, with such diversity as it had, was sidelined to some degree. And at the same time, within the Cabinet Office at Number 10, there was a lack of diversity. There were references to, obviously, a lack of, remarkable absence of women in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office. The invisibility of children, the invisibility of the position of ethnic minorities and vulnerable groups and those in poverty-stricken areas. So there was no real means by which diversity of view was being channeled into the ultimate decision-making body, the Prime Minister, and the 2 or 3 people around him.
There was diversity of view. In some regards, I don't think there was the sort of full diversity that you're describing. I can tell you that not everybody in the room agreed all the time. That certainly would be an incorrect description of what was going on.
I'm sure there was no unanimity of opinion on every topic.
I'm sure we'll come on to those as well. But we made, certainly in relation to the civil service, we made very deliberate steps to try and address this. So in the senior leadership of the COVID task force, we tried to make sure we had sort of 50-50 on gender balance. But actually, that's important. There was also the issue of the breadth of experience. So one of the things when we set up the COVID task force that I wanted to do was make sure we brought in people from government departments or other places where they'd actually been working in the real world on things. So, for example, Kate Josephs, who came from the education system, Cathy Hall, who came in and worked in NHS trusts, to make sure that sitting around the table with the Prime Minister, we had people who were much closer, who'd had much closer exposure and experience of real world decision-making and the effects on public services.
303-253, page 16. The 19th of May, at the bottom of the page, so page 16 of this document. Helen McNamara said to you,
I remember
this has been the most actively sexist environment I've ever worked in. It is plain, and we needn't go into the detail of it, that your predecessor, Mark Sedwill, was, it essentially came to be forced to agree to leave the post of Cabinet Secretary, although he didn't actually leave until September. And it's plain that Mr. Johnson, at the behest of Mr. Cummings, drove through that change. But other than in relation to the prospective departure of the Cabinet Secretary, what other major personnel changes were made in Downing Street to address these issues of lack of diversity, sexism, the toxicity of the atmosphere that Helen McNamara referred to? What actually was done?
So inside Downing Street, I'm not sure I can give you the sort of the full run. I can give you the run on COVID, which goes on to sort of what I've said, is that we, on a number of different fronts, tried to diversify sorry, that's a terrible way to describe recruiting people from a range of different backgrounds. But we actually, as I've just said, tried to bring in people with different perspectives into the senior leadership of the civil service team working on COVID.
Who were the
Kathy Hall, Kate
big
Josephs
beasts
that I just mentioned,
Right.
who came in as leaders of the COVID task force alongside Simon Ridley, who you've heard from.
So putting aside the COVID task force, which was a new body which was instituted in order to address some of the structural problems which you've identified, what major personnel changes were there within number 10?
I don't think the major changes in personnel in number 10 changed until November, December 2020 and January 2021, when the Prime Minister changed the top of his political team. Lord Lister left, and he brought in a different set of special advisors and made sure that there were more women at the top of, I think, his senior political team.
And Mr. Cummings had, of course, himself left.
He left in November, mid-November.
Other than that, and those changes were brought about, of course, almost a year later or a year after the dawning of the crisis, there were no real political changes, were there, in Downing Street during that summer and autumn, and notwithstanding the very serious issues that Hannah McNamara,
I think that's right,
had endlessly debated.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that the former Prime Minister acknowledged that himself in his own evidence. I don't think it was until November and Mr. Cummings' departure that the set of changes to the political team happened, if I remember correctly.
Turning to a different topic, and reverting back to the issue of the MIGs. So the Ministerial and Implementation Groups met, well, at least the General Public Services Ministerial Implementation Group, to which of which you were a part, met for the last time in May, on the 21st of May. And on the 22nd of May, you were appointed as the permanent secretary, and therefore you left your role as the senior responsible officer,
Correct.
the SRO, to use other terminology, on the GPS, the General Public Services MIG, Ministerial Implementation Group. And the MIGs were then disbanded and replaced by COVID-S and COVID-O. You yourself had raised the issue of domestic abuse to women and girls, and how they were an important group who needed to be protected and to have their interests safeguarded. When the GPS MIG was disbanded, do you happen to know who took over your role as the SRO for that particular group? I
cannot remember the name.
Was it somebody on COVID-O or S? Because there were no MIGs thereafter. So.
No, it was somebody who I think there may be a period where it was effectively my deputy from the non-shielded vulnerable programme, an excellent official called Kay Withers took it. I think there was a month or so when it was sort of operating directly to Michael Gove as the lead minister. But then after that point, if I remember correctly, that became a sub-unit under Simon Ridley in the COVID task force.
With other vulnerable groups, or
yes, with other all of that, the set of groupings that were in that presentation we had was covered by, I think, that team in the COVID task force.
The minutes of COVID-O and COVID-S show that domestic abuse was never, or was very rarely, if at all, discussed in the format of those committees. Are we therefore to take it that it was confined to the COVID task force, which of course didn't really get up and going in the autumn?
Sorry if I'm disagreeing on a point. My recollection is actually they did come up in COVID-S meetings, because the Home Secretary in particular, then Priti Patel, I remember raising it. I may be thinking of Cabinet perhaps, but I know that it was something that she raised regularly in ministerial fora.
All right. In the summer of 2020, the COVID task force, which had just started, or just commenced, is established a project on disproportionately impacted groups. And there was a small team, and I'm using the words, in fact, from Simon Ridley's statement, created in the task force to lead on disproportionately impacted groups. You may not be able to remember, but if the needs of vulnerable groups was being addressed by COVID-S and COVID-O and by the centre of government, why was it necessary to have to institute another or a new small team in the task force to deal with such matters?
I think this is to do with the way, I mean, this is about how you divide up labour and organise things. So that's probably a good example. They sat in the COVID task force, making sure, working with the rest of government departments. COVID task force wasn't responsible for the delivery of all of these things. They would coordinate with departments and they'd make sure that across all the work of the COVID task force, they would make sure those issues were properly represented. So I think if I remember correctly, there were 2, maybe 3 COVID-O meetings specifically on those groups in COVID-S papers and maybe COVID-O papers. They sort of advised to the Prime Minister. It was making sure that those issues were raised there. So I think that's what that team was doing, if I remember correctly.
All right. Now may we turn to the question of the devolved administrations?
Yes.
So just before you do, could I ask a question, Dr. Case? The O and S system, so I'm going to call that, had operated during
Brexit.
Operation Yellow, during Brexit arrangements. I would have expected that if you had a national civil emergency, there'd be structures in place, so they swept into action. So COBRA comes into action when there's an emergency. But having used COVID-O and COVID-S, or the equivalent during Brexit, it takes a while for COVID-O and COVID-S to start. We had the MIGs.
Yep.
So why is there no structure that, as it were, immediately steps into action when you have a national civil emergency?
Well, I think rather good recommendation, potentially. I think it is because sort of the COBRA system in relation to certainly sort of domestic crises has sort of developed from the 1970s onwards, and the sense was we manage crises through COBRA. The problem had always been with COBRA is that it's very effective in certain circumstances on the day of a terrorist attack, serious flooding, those sorts of things. We've actually for a long time had this problem about how you deal, as the sort of the specialists call it, once you've gone from the acute to the chronic. And there hasn't been such a strong tradition. And actually, that is where I think, as you sort of said, the S and the O model, originally XS and XO, COVID-S, COVID-O, is now, I believe that's sort of now in the DNA of Whitehall about how you deal with these major issues.
Thank you.
But, a firm recommendation wouldn't be amiss.
And I think Milady will have had in mind that the evidence from at least a couple of witnesses who observed that COBRA is particularly good for dealing with immediate single event crises. Yeah. Rather than the sort of crisis which might envelop a whole country.
Exactly right. I think, maybe it's not in this module, maybe in the first module, very experienced Bruce Mann, who was one of the original one of the brains behind CCS, I think was always pretty clear about this failure, our inability to think beyond the initial crisis. And I think, certainly for as long as I have this job, I will be certainly recommending to whoever the Prime Minister may be that XSXO model is a good way of managing that breadth of business alongside a task force. However, the thing that we need to tackle through that is exactly this question about the diversity of thought. The problem with COVID-S particular is they're small meetings. They don't usually have that many ministers there, usually because you are talking about really sensitive, difficult issues. So most prime ministers in the end prefer smaller meetings on the really difficult decisions. The thing we have to crack is how we get the diversity of thought into into that space. So I think I would continue to recommend COVID-S, COVID-O style models, but I don't yet personally have the answer, and perhaps Milady does, about how we balance that need for the small meeting to do the really difficult stuff that prime ministers need to do with the funneling mechanism to make sure around that table you've got all of the views that you need. Some of that you can do through the paperwork and through a task force and make sure you've got right teams making sure the issues are fed through. And maybe that's the answer that we have to stick to. But in my view, it needs more thought, and I'm sorry I can't offer a more concrete answer.
Document 183934 is your it's a document responding to your report with Helen McNamara of the 26th of May 2020 concerning cabinet committees.
I remember this handwriting.
Yes, that is. Well, perhaps you would confirm whose handwriting it is.
Oh, that is definitely Boris Johnson's handwriting. Yes. It took me a while to learn how to decipher it.
And we can see.
I don't know whether I've lost the knack.
We can see right at the bottom of the page it says Simon C. That's you, Simon Case, to hold the pen and to draw up, because the then Prime Minister was asking for proposals in response to a document which had proposed standing down the MIGs, as you've said, and establishing COVID-O and COVID-S. But I want to ask you, please, page 3, about what was to be done with the devolved nations.
Yes.
Or the devolved administrations. At paragraph 6, you said this: the devolved administrations have been involved in decision-making through the MIGs and in COBRA. But pausing there, Dr. Case, the MIGs were being stood down. COBRA convened less and less. Correct. And indeed, from May onwards, it convened very few times indeed.
Absolutely right.
Because power drained towards, or was dragged towards, COVID-S and COVID-O. There needs to be a mechanism, you recognise, to discuss and agree on a four-nation approach. You could convene a joint ministerial committee meeting when needed instead. COBRA would stop meeting on COVID unless we re-entered a crisis situation, and it's important for ministers to continue to engage with city mayors. Do you agree to use the JMC to manage conversations with the devolved administrations and only use COBRA if we re-enter a crisis situation? Now, he didn't, in fact, annotate the document to say yes or no, as he had done at the top of the page. And in his comments on the box return, on the front page, he said nothing about the relationship, the DAs or the structure. The reality proved to be, did it not, that COBRA stopped effectively sitting, the MIGs ended, the JMC was never, if ever, convened.
I don't think it was ever convened on COVID.
And the structural relationship or the mechanism for dealing with the DAs in the face of a pan-United Kingdom crisis, which affected them, of course, no less than London, was not put into place, or if it was, it just didn't happen.
That's absolutely right.
Why? How was that ball dropped?
I think, so as you say, because the Prime Minister didn't annotate this, and I just don't have a clear memory. I'm sort of trying to piece it back together. I think, as the Prime Minister said in either his own written evidence or oral evidence, former Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson said, he actually had a real aversion to sitting around a table sort of with First Ministers. I think he said, like we're some form of the EU or something like that.
He said, as though the United Kingdom were a kind of mini EU of four nations and we were meeting as a council in a federal structure.
Yeah. So, he had a real aversion to it. He delegated it very much to Michael Gove as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. So I remember asking that, I think it was in June, it's in the documents, I think it was June, that Michael Gove would chair regular meetings I think, in effect, they didn't start happening until September or October time. I think that's you've already heard that in evidence. Matt Hancock, as the Health Secretary, I think did still keep having regular contact with the health ministers. Chris Whitty did the 4 CMOs, the 4 nations CMOs, which I think was a real engine room for us. And there were others, such as Sue Gray, who was then our permanent secretary, thinking about union matters, ran weekly meetings. It's absolutely correct that at the first minister level, the Prime Minister and First Ministers only got together in those cobras that were called before the big new crisis moment, so the second lockdown, for example. So I think it's a combination. I think it's politics and personality.
Well, let me ask you, it's obvious that no structure was put in place to replace the regular meetings of COBRA, which had allowed the DAs full participation. The JMC never convened, and the Gove calls didn't start, as you say, until September, October. At the highest political level, there was no mechanism by which the United Kingdom and its 4 constituent nations could confer. Was that because you appreciated that the Prime Minister just did not want it to take place because he believed, as you've said, it was optically wrong?
Yeah, that's my memory of the sense of the time, and I think that's also what he said. I mean, one of the there's other thing I should do. I remember writing to Matt Hancock, Rishi Sunak as Chancellor, and Michael Gove on the formation of COVID-S and COVID-O, and I think I wrote in that letter the expectation was that the devolved administrations, I don't think I used the language by default. It should be more often than not that they were invited to COVID-Os. I haven't done the maths to see how often they were invited, but I don't think it was as often as was intended either.
Yes, you did indeed say that, and the reality was, in fact, that they didn't attend all the COVID-Os, and they didn't attend the COVID-Ss at all.
No, they definitely didn't attend the COVID-Ss. Yeah.
Just on this document, could we look, please, at page 4? There's a rather remarkable paragraph 8, where you and Helen McNamara suggest to your own Prime Minister that he might want to discuss with the Chancellor whether he wanted to establish an Economic Recovery Council to coordinate the response to the crisis along the same lines as the National Economic Council responded to the financial crisis. Do you want to see further advice and discuss this with the Chancellor? Did somebody else intervene in this process of seeking the Prime Minister's views and express their own views rather peremptorily?
That's how I read that. So I think the front page of this document, if I remember correctly, of this box return, there's a handwritten scribble from Dom that says, "I've handwritten some thoughts on this." You know, in fact, so I'm assuming this is the actual version that the Prime Minister saw, and I assume no, Dom is that that's him saying no. Yeah.
If we go back to page 1, please. Was he the top?
Oh, sorry, page 1 of the note rather than the Prime Minister's
Page 2,
comments.
top right-hand corner. Yes, I've scribbled in annexes. Dom. So then going back to that page 4. Was it usual for a special political advisor, however eminent and powerful, to reject a serious policy proposal being advanced to the Prime Minister in this way?
Oh, I mean, yes. I mean, if you look at the papers being released at the moment from the Tony Blair era. You've got, Jonathan Powell, who was a political advisor as the Chief of Staff, writing things on notes. The thing that I think matters importantly and constitutionally is that, this is the advice from senior officials. What hasn't happened here is he hasn't taken it out and say, I don't want the Prime Minister to see civil service advice. It's just that, as is quite normal, the special advisor has given their own perspective on the advice. That's actually normal.
Could we have, please, 265763? It's a message chain between yourself and Michael Gove.
Yeah.
And on page 2, which is the 7th of September, 2020,
Yeah.
at 15:21,
Yeah.
55.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
I've now
with the
lost-
bottom one,
I think it
the
must-
daft
Oh, yes.
question. Has
Thank you very much. Yes, very good, Dr. Case. Mr. Gove, in fact, told my lady about this exchange and was asked about the daft laddie question. But to remind ourselves, he says, is the Prime Minister's day structured in the way you'd want to enable all the decisions that need to be taken are taken in a timely way? Thank you. Are the right people in the room in every meeting to drive progress? Are the right people excluded? Are the right cross-Whitehall arrangements in place to ensure early, rapid, rigorous implementation of those decisions without falling over each other? And I'm sure you will say immediately, Dr. Case, that this wasn't the complete answer, but you said the answer to all these questions is no. On one view, it is a very worrying feature that even by September of 2020, you were unable to answer the question, are the right cross-Whitehall arrangements in place? With a yes.
I think this is the day or the day before I become Cabinet Secretary, which I think is why Mr. Gove was posing the question at this point. My remit had obviously was now significantly beyond COVID, so I don't think this is actually just about COVID. This is on the eve of becoming Cabinet Secretary. And the answer was no. And I mean, I'd worked in, Downing Street. I mean, for David Cameron and Theresa May, they took their decisions in a different way. They set up their structures in a different way. I've obviously since been Cabinet Secretary to Liz Truss and now Rishi Sunak. No two Prime Ministers do it in the same way that fits their character and their style of working. I don't think we really ever got to this place with Mr. Johnson. I think we made sort of progress. I mean, particularly in relation to COVID through sort of 2021, late 2020, 2021, we were getting into sort of regular pattern. But it was there was a tussle to get, in my view, the right people in the room when I first started. I think, there's material where I'm saying we've got to get Matt Hancock into the room. He's the health secretary. He needs to be there at these discussions. And others are saying, well, we don't want him there for X or Y reason, which I imagine we'll come on to. But, it was a challenge to get the order. As I say, other prime ministers, even though they do things differently, and there'd been debate in those things, there was more structure than there was under Mr. Johnson.
Dr. Case, corporately, the government had 9 months to get cross-Whitehall arrangements in place. And this isn't a reference, is it, just to the particular format or characteristics of a Johnsonian sofa government. This is a reference to the structural arrangements across Whitehall. But you are unable to say that the right arrangements are in place, even then.
Well, I'm sure we'll come on to. I mean, that's right, and I don't, you're the way you put it, it's correct. It was very difficult to get structured ways of working during this time. Incredibly difficult.
During as long as the first 9 months of this crisis?
Yes. There were things were better, I can tell you that. I think, during the summer, COVID, I mean, I'm limiting to COVID as I know that's sort of your main interest. COVID-S, COVID-O, COVID task force, I think brought much more structure to COVID decision taking, and I think other witnesses have sort of backed that up from outside. Not me sort of singing to my own tune. I think our critical partners across Treasury, the health system, what have you, thought our dashboard structure, COVID-S, COVID-O task force made things better. But I think this is much more broad about all of government, as I say, because I think this is the eve of becoming Cabinet Secretary. And it took us a long time to get the right rhythm and structures across other areas of government too.
Getting it right and getting the structures in place were what government was meant to do.
Yeah.
That is your job. It was your primary function.
Yeah, I was Cabinet Secretary, and as you could see, and I think you'll see elsewhere, I set about trying to fix it. I tried to fix it in relation to COVID when I got the job of coordinating the COVID response as Permanent Secretary in Number 10. I think, as you can see on the non-shielded vulnerable work, I tried to sort of bring it all together. This was what I was trying to do, was, this is at the heart of the job of the civil service, is we've got to create reliable structures. We have to work with the personalities we've got. Our job is to keep the government going as best we can and, adapt to the personalities around us and try and make it work. That's our job. But sadly, it doesn't always turn up on day one. It takes time to build.
The absence of those structures represented a serious failure of governance for those long months between February 2020 and the autumn.
I'd say, as I said, things improved, but even now, even at the end, not perfect.
Can we now look at another feature of the system at the highest level of government, namely the bilaterals between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor? Could you just explain very briefly what Prime Ministerial and Chancellor bilats are, Dr. Case?
Yeah, usually weekly meetings between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. Generally, they would be, the attendance varies depending on the particular personalities. I think during the Blair-Brown era, very few other people attended those meetings. During the Johnson-Sunak era, generally they would have been attended by private secretaries, principal private secretaries to both Prime Minister and Chancellor, and probably, a senior special advisor each, and sometimes Cabinet Secretary or other senior officials would attend.
The obvious purpose of a bilateral is to provide an important forum at which the Chancellor can express his or her views to the Prime Minister.
Yeah, the relationship between the First Lord of the Treasury and the second, i.e. the Prime Minister and the Treasury, and the Chancellor, is one of the most important relationships in government and can make or break a government.
And the secret's in the wording on the face of the tin, isn't it? The Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury, and the Chancellor,
well, literally, that is the wording on the Prime Minister's letterbox on the door of Downing Street, Number 10.
Did that system of bilaterals, at which the Prime Minister was expected to listen to his Chancellor and thereafter to form his own view, work well, in your opinion?
Yes, I think they did. I think Mr. Johnson and Mr. Sunak, sort of certainly through the COVID period, I think had a good relationship. I didn't see all those meetings. I thought it was a pretty candid relationship, which is vital. I don't think it sort of afforded the Chancellor an unfair advantage over other elements of COVID decision making because, I may be anticipating incorrectly the thrust, but the Prime Minister had a lot of time with, for example, Chris and Patrick, as it were, without the Chancellor there as well. Those, in my recollection, Chris, Patrick, and Rishi Sunak as Chancellor were the most important voices, for Boris Johnson during COVID period that I saw. Credit
to you, Dr. Case. You correctly anticipated what I was about to ask you, because at the time, and we have obviously WhatsApps between yourself and Tom Shinner and Simon Ridley, and also WhatsApps between you and Boris Johnson in June and October 2020. You express your concern that the bilateral process, and it may be thought to reflect quite well on the current Prime Minister, had become a forum at which the former Prime Minister was bounced or forced into a U-turn, or indeed, as you described it, and these are your own words, it can't always be you agreeing with Rishi.
Yeah, I mean, one's the Prime Minister and one's the Chancellor. You know, in the end, the Prime Minister is the boss, and certainly in my experience, Rishi Sunak was always very clear that that was the nature of the relationship. I mean, it's no secret they were very different personalities. They took decisions in different ways, but they were good meetings. And it was a good, it was a good relationship. It was really important relationship. I think, I mean, obviously it's been an important relationship for a while, but I'm struck by going back as part of preparation for this, reading the May 2020 roadmap, where the discussion of the economic consequences of lockdown start to appear in that May roadmap, and that discussion is the key thread, balancing COVID health and outcomes against the economic consequences of lockdown is, for me, the sort of the key theme of the May unlocking and then ramp back up to the second lockdown.
So important a relationship, Dr. Case, that you were driven to WhatsApp your own Prime Minister to tell him that the relationship between him and his Chancellor was being operated in such a way that you had to advise him to stop agreeing all the time with his own Chancellor.
Yes, well, that would be reasonable, because the Chancellor's job, quite properly, is to put forward the economic case, the economic argument. Usually, Chancellors are very senior political figures who's got a broader view than that, but that is at the core of the Chancellor's job. The Prime Minister's job is to balance that with a lot of other considerations. So I think that's me saying to the Prime Minister, you do the job of Prime Minister and he'll do the job of Chancellor.
But that's what he was not doing, that you felt emboldened to write to him to say, you can't always bend to the will of the Chancellor, you are the Prime Minister.
Yes, I mean, just as you, well, I mean, that statement of the blindingly obvious relationship between the two of them.
Yes. Just then, dealing finally with, in this area, the Helen McNamara report.
Yeah.
We needn't go to it in detail. Helen McNamara gave evidence before my lady. Her review, to which you assisted in to a very large extent, revealed the toxic and misogynistic culture in number 10. And you'll recall, because you've said you've refreshed your memory on the evidence, her report referred to the superhero bun fight culture and the bad behaviour, showboating, belittling others, the macho culture, and so on. She said that the female perspective was being missed in advice and decision-making and so on. What did you do? How was that culture addressed, and did it dissipate? I should say, before you answer, my lady had evidence from Martin Reynolds, who said that even by the autumn, it remained an ongoing cultural issue. Yeah. And your own statement has said, with the benefit of hindsight, it took too long to address this culture.
Yeah, absolutely right. It did sort of agree with the premise. I mean, in terms of what I did in relation to my direct responsibility, i.e. the COVID task force, we actually had, alongside that report, and I've submitted it as I've exhibited it as part of my statement. We actually had an external group give us recommendations about things that needed to change and how I should go about setting up the task force. So we've already covered. They recommended a change in leadership around COVID, which I did through the COVID task force leadership. Clarifying roles and responsibilities, basic stuff. We made sure across the COVID task force, didn't do it on day one. It took us a few weeks, but actually who was responsible for what and to whom were they responsible for. Organisational resilience, which is one of the things they point out. I mean, people. I said, people were absolutely shattered. They'd been working 7 days a week, all hours. They know they'd made mistakes. So we just did the simple things like make sure proper rotas were in place so people weren't working all of the hours. We made sure that secondments were time limited so people could roll in and roll out. There was one of the other things that I think was a real challenge. Certainly, I remember talking to this with Helen, and it came out of this review or recommendations that I should do, is that in that first phase, before I joined, strategy and sort of delivery or implementation, sort of awful words again, I'm sorry, my lady, but, thinking and doing were being all muddled up. And so often the urgent decisions were actually crowding out the long-term thinking. So we very deliberately set up in the COVID task force a split between these are the people who are doing the long-term thinking and here are the people doing the delivery. And we talked already about getting the right balance of people, the right sort of experience in, so we did that. So that's what we did in the COVID task force. I agree completely with Martin. In terms of number 10, it was, it was autumn, winter, sort of early 2021 before it got there. But, Mr. Johnson is somebody who, he admitted, I think, in his own evidence that he just didn't get certainly didn't get the gender balance right for this. He's also somebody who sort of thrives on, as I said, the competition, the debate playing out in front of them, and because that's how he took decisions. So that element of competition that was how he ran his premiership.
Forgive me.
Sorry.
My question was directed at what was done in number 10 about the toxic, sexist, misogynistic culture. And you've answered by way of references to the changes in the working practices, the rotas, the hours, the institution of the COVID task force, and also what Mr. Johnson himself referred to as the disputatious culture. What was done about the individuals who were directly contributing to that toxic, macho, misogynistic and sexist atmosphere?
Sorry, I mean, as you can...
Were they moved on?
Not, I think, not until later.
Not ever?
No, I think some of them were. I mean, by 2021, there'd been a pretty wholesale change around the number 10 political team, I think.
All right. Well, ladies, that's a convenient moment.
Certainly, we'll break now for, I should be extremely generous and give you 12 minutes till 20 past 12, and then we'll have a shorter break before lunch.
Thank you.
Sorry, a shorter stint before lunch.
All rise.
Your statement, Dr. Case, makes plain that one of the aims of the putting into place of a central organisational design, as you called it, for the COVID response, that is to say, a unitary body that could ultimately determine the broad direction of the government's response, was to ensure that there was a proper forum for the weighing up of the intensely difficult considerations that had to be considered. So bluntly, a body in which the factors such as, the primary factors such as the public health need to impose, for example, a lockdown in order to get the R rate back down below 1, and the countervailing need to ensure that the country and its citizens are not destroyed in the process.
Yeah.
And it's obvious that the COVID task force was enabled to start addressing those issues, as was, we can see, COVID-S. To what extent had there been a forum before the COVID task force was instituted for the weighing up the trade-offs in that balance?
I'm not aware that there was one. I think it was one of the challenges, in particular, of the, I think it was 4 separate MIG structures. They almost siloed the things. And then I think supported by individual teams, so officials, people like me, helping run the meetings, prepare the papers. I think it was divided, and so it was only the balancing act, as you're sort of talking about, was only done really, I think, at the structures before I joined Number 10 were a 9:15 meeting and that sort of thing. So that's why I thought the COVID task force, COVID-S particular thing was important, was having a single team of officials who could synthesize the issues in papers that then went to COVID-S, COVID-O, I thought was important.
May her ladyship infer from the fact that there was no real body for the debate, for the discussion of how these difficult competing interests and issues should be weighed up and balanced? Should she infer that at the time of the lockdown in March 2020, there had been, in fact, no real debate about the economic and social consequences of a lockdown? There had been no real weighing up of these countervailing interests, because the reality of the crisis that faced the government was that in March 2020, it was the public health agenda, the absolute need just to prevent the NHS from collapsing and the need to bring the R rate down, that won the day.
I need to be careful here because I wasn't in those meetings, obviously, but that's my reading as well.
In the press and in the public arena, due in part to the calls from those who might be described as anti-lockdown advocates, the calls from Professor Henno and others, there was a very lively, a very real, a very obvious, a highly polarized debate taking place about whether or not the public health demands of the crisis and the need for lockdown should exceed to and be outweighed by the need to avoid economic and societal damage.
Yeah.
How can the government possibly have got itself in the position whereby that vital and necessary debate was not being properly addressed within its own organs? Yeah. Other than, and obviously it was being discussed on a daily basis, between you, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, Sir Chris Whitty, Sir Patrick Vallance, and a small handful of officials in Number 10.
So I wasn't part of those discussions. I started.
I say you.
Sorry. Okay, understood. Collective. I think. I mean, I sort of need to be very careful because I mean, this is my assessment because I don't. Is that in relation to the first lockdown, the danger presented by COVID and probably the lack of understanding about the virus meant the imperative in the first lockdown felt incredibly clear to those that were there. I don't know, I wasn't there. I suspect there was a lot more debate than my characterization suggests, but I think that would be my assessment, is that the problem that we're fixing is clear and we must act. I think that debate that you're describing, led by, you characterise it sort of anti-lockdown, that was absolutely at play during, I'd say, July, August, September, October 2020. I think, oddly enough, because of the arrivals of the vaccine, The decision around the third lockdown in early 2021 felt less difficult. We'd had the Alpha variant, but by that stage we had vaccines that worked. Again, the clarity of the decision-making was, of course, the government didn't really want to have to lock down again and sort of the harms that we were talking about. But the vaccines meant there was a route out. All the way through the autumn, late summer, autumn, the Prime Minister and I think the Chancellor at the time were looking for what's the route out. And until vaccines came along, that gave us the route out. There was an end. But that middle period, that debate was really active and really difficult.
Is there not, therefore, a powerful argument that there should have been, and perhaps consideration should have been given to, the setting up of an advisory structure like SAGE, but SAGE, of course, is a scientific advisory group dealing primarily with the particular epidemiological perhaps the quasi-medical side of things, but a body that could have helped the Prime Minister and senior politicians and Number 10 weigh up those competing considerations to assess, for example, what any quality-adjusted life years assessment might come up with. And I'll ask you a few questions about that in a moment. Why wasn't such a body thought about that could have provided a proper, transparent, accountable structure within the heart of government to do what was plainly not being done in any sort of systemic and carefully formulated way?
I think the establishment of the COVID task force, as you said in your opening earlier on, was an attempt to bring together those imperatives, impacts, inputs, and make sure that in the material going then, by that stage, to ministers in COVID-S or COVID-O, that those balances, those impacts were set out. So I think if you look at the papers from, I think we had the first meeting of COVID-S on, I think it was early June, all the way through in those papers, we are talking about the balance of COVID health, non-COVID health, societal impact and economic impact. And that's really what the task force was trying to do, was bring all of those inputs together. I think on sort of a super advisory body that almost sits above SAGE, I mean, in the end, the question is how many layers do you need before you actually get to ministers who would take, how many experts sitting on experts do you need before you get to ministers? In the end, they're the ones who have to take the decisions. I think there is an interesting question that I know you've addressed, and I'll be quick on it, around this idea of the economic sort of SAGE question.
Can we come on to
I'll leave
later?
Okay.
That is a separate issue.
All right.
On the societal and economic impacts of a lockdown.
So that was coming in. I mean, that material was coming in from the Treasury, I mean, really through the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, who do all the forecasting, the Bank of England. I think the weakness early on, certainly in my time, was that the economic data and the forecasting was quite static. It was sort of done quarter by quarter. By the autumn, certainly early 2021, the system of getting data about what was happening on the transmission of the virus, hospitalisation, intensive care, whatever, all to do with that system was built up to give us quite a rich picture, regional, what was happening. I don't think then we really had that quite such rich picture from the economic side. We've addressed this largely through changes that we've made to how ONS collect data, the way the Bank of England does, etc. now. But I think at that point, what I remember on the on the daily dashboard meetings is each day you'd come in, the dashboard meeting, the team would talk about the highlights, and each day there'd be something new to say about COVID, because there'd be daily data, the ONS would give us their weekly survey. On the economic data, we didn't really have the same thing. We had long-term quarter-by-quarter forecasts from the bank or the OBR. we had some economic data which had actually come from the private sector, where they helped us understand what footfall was at shopping centres once they were reopened. Transport for London were giving us the data about the number of people using the transport system, but it didn't feel as rich and as dynamic as the COVID data did.
Is that why you'll recall Ben Warner said in his evidence that there was a paucity of economic data? It wasn't that there was a shortage of data per se, it was just that the data, economic data being received by Number 10 was of a particular type and frequency.
Yeah, I think that's right. And apologies to Treasury colleagues if I've mischaracterised it, but that's my memory.
In the autumn, the Prime Minister asked you whether or not any sort of quality-adjusted life years estimate had been done on the costs of lockdown. And just pausing there,
Yes.
the quality-adjusted life years measure or assessment is a system by which, bluntly, a view can be reached as to whether or not a lockdown is worth the candle in terms of the damage that is undoubtedly done,
Yeah.
and also whether or not, in the absence of a lockdown, what the consequences will be in terms of death and injury,
Yes.
and whether or not, in the general scale of things, and there's no easy way of putting it, that is a price worth paying.
Yeah.
It's a vital issue.
Yes.
Because only by understanding the terrible consequences of either route can you weigh them up.
Yeah.
But there was nobody, there was no system, there was no committee, there was no structure in the summer and the early autumn that was actually looking specifically at whether or not any kind of scientific measure of quality adjusted life years would drive the conclusion that either a lockdown was necessary and a price worth paying, or that it wasn't.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. We actually had, I think, two different goes at trying a sort of quali, as it's called, approach. So actually, I think the first was in the summer, not long after I'd started in the COVID task force, because actually one of my predecessors, in fact, you've heard from him,
if I can interrupt,
Lord O'Donnell.
You said, in fact, to the Prime Minister that you attempted it in the summer, but there'd been insufficient data or evidence to do the assessment.
Yeah, so if I...
And may I ask, who did it? Who did that assessment?
In the COVID task force.
But the COVID task force wasn't operating effectively until late May, June.
May, yeah. So it was when I set up the COVID task force in May. That's certainly the first time I know we had a go was in that summer, and we tried to do it inside the COVID task force.
Are we talking about one paper or a meeting or what?
I think the team of analysts that we had a go. I think we had a couple of meetings on it, but I don't think we ever took it to ministers because it just simply wasn't advanced enough.
Right. In hindsight, would you accept that lack of analysis was critical?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about the quali process, as I understand it in the health system today, it's underpinned by a very sort of serious analytical underpinning that's been built up over years. I think it's done by NICE, if I remember correctly, and I'm sorry I can't remember to spell out that group, but there's it's taken sort of years to develop it, and it's a really sophisticated system. So a system like that in government, actually, that works across, would be a very interesting thing to sort of set up, because it's very difficult to do it in the moment. I think it would have to be a sort of a system that was established and run through peacetime so that it was valuable in wartime. Forgive the analogy, but...
Can we just focus on the importance of this omission, Dr. Case? In October, on the 28th of October, the Prime Minister himself, in his box return comments,
that's right,
on the front sheet of a report prepared for him by the COVID task force, listed, I think, at least 22 agonising points.
Yes, he did. It was extraordinary,
In the face of having to make the decision as to whether or not there should be a second lockdown, 2 days before the lockdown was decided. And he exclaimed in the course of those, in that cri de coeur,
Yeah.
if we carry on with this endless lockdown strategy, there must logically come a moment when the attempt to protect the population is more harmful than the disease. This was 2 days before the second
lockdown,
national
yeah.
lockdown.
Yeah.
There had been ample time for the government, as the press had been calling, as scientists in the public domain had been calling, for this analysis to be carried out to help the Prime Minister decide which side of the awful lockdown debate he would ultimately fall.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't done, was it?
No, as I said, we had attempts at it, but we could not make a system, generate a system that did it. Actually, by the way, I think, going back to an earlier point about the value of the Chancellor Prime Minister bilateral, I think the Chancellor was really, the then Chancellor, Mr. Sunak, was very hot on this quality approach, and I think that's an example of him raising questions with the Prime Minister that the Prime Minister's then articulating.
Well, and obviously the Chancellor, wearing as he does a Treasury hat, was concerned to avoid the terrible economic consequences of lockdown, and therefore promoted at every available opportunity the argument, don't lock down, because any quality assessment will show that the price you pay for a lockdown is just too great.
Yeah,
right.
It is not correct to say there were no attempts to articulate the economic, societal and non-COVID health consequences of lockdowns when you go through the papers all the way through July, August,
there was a general,
September, October. There are general attempts to describe them, but there is not a numerical model that's been done. I agree that would be a very sensible thing, a very good thing to have running. As I say, I think it actually is, as I understand the system that supports it in the health world, it's a really sophisticated thing that would be, I think it would be a very sensible thing to build and get going so that in future you're not having to do it then.
Dr. Case, the generalists in the civil service and the politicians were only too aware of the price that would be paid by virtue of a second or lockdown or a second lockdown. It was obvious. Everybody in the entire country knew what the price would be for another lockdown in terms of economic and societal damage. But that wasn't the point. The point is there was no developed scientific advisory structure that could at least help to resolve that conundrum. And
Correct.
months passed, months and months. And then it wasn't until after the second lockdown was actually in place, on the 2nd of November, in an email chat, a WhatsApp chat between Simon Ridley and a number of Number 10 officials, did he ask for SAGE to produce estimates and modelling on the non-COVID health and societal impacts of a lockdown. So it wasn't until after the second lockdown had even started that call went out for assistance.
Correct. I agree with your whole thrust here. It's a thing that we must fix in advance of any. It won't just be pandemic. It would be valuable across other decisions that government has to take, and possibly not even just in crisis times.
Yeah. Now, I just want to ask you some specific questions about a handful of disparate and particular areas. Shortly before you became Permanent Secretary on the 20th of May, the May 2020 roadmap was published. I think it was published on the 13th of May, and it announced step one. I apologise, it wasn't published on the 13th of May. I think step one was going to take place on the 13th of May. Shortly thereafter, there was some WhatsApp messages between you and Mark Sedwill, in fact on the 22nd of May, in which you refer to Mark Sedwill having suggested that Sir Patrick Vallance and Sir Chris Whitty be excluded from a meeting with the Prime Minister, at which the easing, the roadmap, was to be discussed. And you said your call about not including Patrick and Chris was genius. It removed that dynamic. Mm-hmm. In what way, Dr. Case, was it sensible or advisable to describe the government's own scientific, medical and scientific advisors as being a dynamic who were required to be removed from a meeting to discuss the lifting of interventions?
Because the Prime Minister had already had many, many discussions with Chris and Patrick about it. And sometimes, to go back to trying to get decisions that sort of worked and stuck with the Prime Minister, if there were too many people in the room putting forward competing views, it would be difficult to get to a decision that would stick. Actually, what happened in that instance was the Prime Minister had already agreed, I believe, an approach with Chris and Patrick to the next steps, and quite straightforwardly then agreed that with the Chancellor.
But, Dr. Case, how can you possibly describe the government's own Chief Scientific Advisor and Chief Medical Officer as being simply a competing view? They were an absolutely essential part of the dynamic in the debate, because they were generally proponents for a public health intervention. Yeah. So to take them out of the equation, to take them out of the audience for the Prime Minister, you're skewing the advice being given to him and therefore the outcome.
I'm sorry, Mr. Keith, I'm going to disagree with you here, because as I said, the Prime Minister had already discussed these matters a great deal with Chris and Patrick. And if anything, if I remember this meeting correctly, it was about getting the Chancellor on board with the proposals that Chris and Patrick had supported. I think that's the dynamic.
But then why was it necessary for you to praise Mark Sedwell for suggesting that they be removed from the meeting? That meeting was the meeting in which the Chancellor and the Prime Minister discussed that package. Primary schools as planned, year 10 to 12 limited, open up the outdoor economy, all non-essential retail from the 15th of June. They were removed from the meeting to make it easier to open up.
No.
The roadmap, were they not?
No. That's the exact opposite of what I've just said, Mr. Keith. The Prime Minister had already agreed, I believe, the proposed package with Chris and Patrick in line, I think, if I remember, I think I'm remembering this right. We'd pre-agreed the right answer with the Prime Minister and Chris and Patrick, and this was an exercise in making sure the Chancellor was comfortable with it. I think the dynamic that Mark and I are talking about was that we thought this ought to, I think Mark's view was it's easier to get these things agreed with the Chancellor, i.e. getting the Chancellor to agree with something he might not like, if the Prime Minister's proposing it rather than Chris and Patrick are proposing it. I think that's the dynamic.
On the 5th of June, on the 2nd of June and the 5th of June, in WhatsApp messages, you referred respectively to you having a fairly big bust-up with the Prime Minister. I lost my rag with him over his flip-flopping. Yeah. And then on the 5th of June, the Prime Minister has had a complete U-turn after a meeting with the Chancellor. Yeah. Was this not the position that when the Prime Minister spoke to the Chancellor, he ended up believing that the country had to be opened up as quickly as possible in order to preserve its economy. And then when he saw his Chief Scientific Advisor and Chief Medical Officer, he backed and veered the other way. So the civil service decided that the best way to resolve the conundrum, to prevent the flip-flopping, was to remove Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance from the equation and thereby allow the easing.
No, that is an incorrect characterisation of that. It's certainly true that later that dynamic that you described, was much more of an issue. That, with Chris and Patrick, it was let's agree this, and with the Chancellor, when it came up, you'd agree that. But in that particular instance you're talking about, the dynamic is the reverse, which is the best way to get the Chancellor to agree something is the Prime Minister's pre-agreed it with Chris and Patrick.
The best way to get the Chancellor to agree is to give him what he wanted, which was the easing and the release from the economy.
Well, yes, had that been the circumstance, yes, in that instance.
You then led, fairly soon thereafter, the review of the 2-metre social distancing guidance.
Yeah.
This was a semi-formal review of what was known as the 2-metre rule. What the government had announced was that there would be a 1 metre plus
correct.
rule. But at around the same time, it was understandably thought, well, that there may be a good basis for reducing the 2-metre rule to just 1 metre. And you prepared a report from Her Majesty's government titled Review of 2-metre Social Distancing Guidance.
Correct.
On the 24th of June. And the review panel was led by you, but it included the government's chief scientific advisor, the chief medical officer, and the chief economic advisor. Did you approach that review with an open mind, Dr. Case?
I did, yes. Ministers I knew wanted to go down to 1 metres because I think, if I remember correctly, there had already been some work done in the economic departments about how that would, support the economy. But obviously, we didn't give them 1 metre. We gave them 1 metre plus.
On the 11th of June, so 2 weeks before the report was published, you WhatsApped the Prime Minister. And before the report had been drafted, at least in its final iteration, you told the Prime Minister that you would announce your intention, that is to say the intention of the review committee, to drop to 1 metre from the 1st of July. So you prejudged your own review and you told the Prime Minister what you would be likely to do.
No, I think this is a sort of slightly dangerous example of taking a single line in a WhatsApp and turning it into a slightly video. So,
well, perhaps we can look at it. Let's have 283296, page 2. At 7:10:20, if we could scroll in, please. It's quite difficult to see.
It's the on the 2 metre rule. I was trying to bring
on the 2 metre rule.
Commas.
So this is the 11th of June. So before the report is, before I think you'd had the final meetings with the CMO and the government chief scientific advisor to decide what you were going to recommend.
Yeah.
On the 2 metre rule, I was planning to bring the review to a conclusion a week tomorrow.
Yeah.
Well, why is the review in parentheses?
I'd first used review in parenthesis on the 8th of June in a discussion with Chris and Patrick. I hated it being called a review and had tried very hard to persuade our ministers not to announce it as a review. This was a piece of policy work, advisory work being done, overseen by myself, Chris Patrick and Claire Lombardelli. This word review is sort of bandied about in government to somehow give a piece of work additional independent status. There's no such thing. We were 4 advisors to government, to ministers, producing our advice. That's what it was. Unfortunately, I lost this battle about not calling it a review. So I'd rather petulantly kept referring to it as review, I think, in exclamation marks. As I said, first example I found is with Chris and Patrick on the 8th of June, so before I'd used it with the Prime Minister. And I think this discussion is actually about the timing rather than the...
When the review was announced, it was called a review. When it was debated in government circles, it was called a review. When it was published, it was called a review. Did you put the word review in inverted commas on the 11th of June? Because it was in truth a put-up job. You had no real intention of seeing where the committee would go and what conclusion it would reach. You intended, perhaps understandably, to do your master's bidding and to bring in what he was desperate for you to recommend, which was that the 2 metre rule could be reduced to 1 metre.
Well, self-evidently that can't be correct, Mr. Key.
And forgive me, Dr. Case, I'm not entirely sure that was a fair question, Mr. Key.
Well,
Is it based on the fact that the word review is in inverted commas? Because if so, Dr. Case has explained it.
Well, then let's look, please, at 0731.
Sorry, did you want to carry on with
Well,
it?
I was just going to say, my answer is no, it wasn't a put-up job. I knew as I went into leading this review with 3 eminent colleagues that economic ministers wanted us to go down to 1 metre. I knew that. As you'll see in the conclusions of the review, we went through this extremely carefully. We went through international comparators, scientific evidence, the economic impact. This is an example going back to Qualies where we actually tried to weigh things up. And we recommended 1 metre plus. If I may quote, we concluded we recommend 2 metres, and where that is not economically or practically viable, 1 metre with risk mitigation is acceptable. And we recommended a clear communications campaign to ensure people didn't adopt 1 metre without mitigation. So even though there's no doubt I was under political pressure to deliver 1 metre, that is not what I delivered. I delivered what we as a panel, because all of the recommendations were signed off by all 4 of us very explicitly, we delivered what we thought was the right balance.
At 073110, if we could scroll back out, I believe it's on the same page. You said to Mr. Johnson, OK, then we are simpatico. I conclude the review next Friday. You consider the conclusions, and then we announce our intention, assuming incidence continues to fall, to drop to 1 metre from the 4th of July. As at 0731 on the 11th of June, had Sir Chris Whitty, Sir Patrick Vallance, yourself, and the 4th member of the committee, I think it was the Chief Economic...
Claire Lombardelli, yeah.
Yes, the Chief Economic Advisor, actually met to decide whether or not you would recommend that the 2 metre rule be reduced to 1 metre?
I think we'd been meeting on a daily basis, I think, by that point. But, I mean, just specifically, this is about the timetable of the 4th of July, which is what this message is really about. As you see, I'm responding to him saying, I think I need this in time for the 4th of July. This is me basically responding, saying we'll have it ready for the 4th of July. I'd already agreed that timetable with Chris, Patrick and Claire before I described it to the Prime Minister.
Why then did you refer to the intention of the committee, our intention, to drop to 1 metre in advance of that committee even forming a view as to whether you would recommend that it be dropped to 1 metre?
As I said, Mr. Keith, I can't quite remember what I was thinking at 07:31 and 10 seconds on the 11th of June 2020. I honestly cannot tell you quite why I used the phrasing I did. As I read this, this is about the timetable, not about the conclusions. And as I've now said several times, we didn't recommend 1 metre. We recommended 2 metres, and where that is not economically and practically viable, 1 metre with risk mitigation.
You do know, don't you, that Sir Patrick Vallance in his evening notes on the 11th of June recorded that the paper from number 10, the Cabinet Office, and then in brackets, Dr. Case, concerning the 1 metre, 2 metre review, he says some person has completely rewritten the same advice as though it's the definitive version. They've just cherry-picked.
Yes.
So what was that about?
He addressed this in his own evidence, which is there's one bit he didn't mention. So first of all, it was an internal first go by somebody in the Cabinet Office. I don't think the thing that Sir Patrick realises the person who rewrote it was one of his own staff members on loan to us to do the review. So it was one of the government scientists who'd been loaned to me to support the review, had rewritten it, so it was one of his own staff.
Why was another member of the committee completely put out that a version of the advice had been rewritten and was purporting to be the definitive version?
You're asking me to describe how Patrick Vallance felt that evening when writing his diary. I'm not sure I can do that. As I said, he's already addressed in his evidence that it was a Cabinet Office internal paper that never went anywhere, so it wasn't part of the review. And as I said, secondly, it was actually written by one of his own scientific staff.
All right, well, we have your evidence. the local lockdown in Leicester,
Yeah.
briefly, please, before lunch. A local lockdown was announced on the 29th of June, you'll recall. And your witness statement makes plain that the data concerning cases in Leicester had been highly inadequate.
Yeah.
And what happened was the inadequacy of the data meant that only at the 11th hour, indeed the 59th minute, was central government in the form of yourself and the Prime Minister and others told that cases were out of control in Leicester. The number 10 had received reassurance for some time that public health measures in Leicester had the situation under control. I'm reading, in fact, from your statement. And the alarm was only raised when the decision was very pressing indeed.
Yeah.
And in the WhatsApps between yourself and Jack Doyle, who was in the communications department, I think, of number 10.
Yeah, that's right.
And also in your number 10 action group WhatsApp communications. And also with Sir Chris Wormold at the DHSC. You expressed your alarm and concern that number 10 had not been aware of the incipient problem and how it had suddenly burst into the open at a very late stage.
I think it was actually, there was more concern than that. I think I'd seen flickers in the data about Leicester in the fortnight before, and I'd specifically asked, is everything under control?
And you were reassured.
And I'd been assured. And then I think what happened is, over a day, it was maybe within the day, we suddenly got told that we needed to do this Leicester and Leicestershire, bits of Leicestershire lockdown, which included, if I remember correctly, getting statutory instruments passed through Parliament, which was not straightforward when it came to the local MPs. You know, there was a disagreement with the local mayor who'd refused to accept the Public Health England data, so Chris Whitty had to spend time with him. It was, you know, and we'll come on to tiering, which was pretty unsatisfactory. It was, we talked in the May roadmap, talked about smarter MPIs. We'd had things going through COVID-S about a contained framework and local lockdowns, and this was the first time we got there, and it just. It felt from my end, I'm sure this isn't how it felt locally to local health officials, but it felt we went from 0 to 1,000,000 miles an hour and needing to pass statutory instruments through Parliament without any discussion or build-up. I think some of that probably was because actually the data, again, this is back to the point, I just don't know whether the data was there. The organisation that we were relying on to pull these data together was the JBC Joint Biosecurity Centre that had been, I think it was probably in only its first or second week of operation. So I think my frustration is actually that the system wasn't there to support the decision making. Sorry, it's a very long answer. Sorry.
Can I draw the threads, attempt to draw the threads together? Firstly, in relation to the first time that this local restriction process was applied, there was a pretty serious failure of government in terms of the very late emergence of the problem, firstly. Secondly, when you inquired into what had gone wrong, it became apparent to you that there were a number of causes. Firstly, local mayors, who of course had to deal with the consequences of the imposition of a local lockdown, simply didn't trust the government's own data.
Correct.
Secondly, there was a general lack of trust in the government because this all came after the Barnard Castle scandal.
Yeah, that's true, yes.
Thirdly, you became aware that there were significant problems within the Department of Health and Social Care because although Mr. Hancock was, as ever, very I'm generally stumped for the right word. Mr. Hancock was ever very proactive in his approach to getting things done.
He was enthusiastic.
Enthusiastic, yes. Thank you. There was a complete absence of strategic and policy support in the DHSE to make that enthusiasm work.
I think that's the bit of the thing I think actually was unfair. Actually, after this, I had been surprised about. I mean, all the way through, I was quite surprised that at the meetings on COVID with the Prime Minister, we'd have the Health Secretary there and we'd have Chris Whitty as the Chief Medical Officer, but we wouldn't have a senior official from DHSC, senior official who was working on something. It might have rotated. And that was out of keeping with the practice for most other departments. When we were meeting on education, the Education Secretary would be supporting officials, and I was quite worried. But actually, after this incident, I spoke to Chris Wormold, who was the Permanent Secretary, to say, is this all right? Are you being excluded from these meetings? Is this a problem? And actually, he reassured me that, in fact, what was happening is they were having quite extensive pre-meetings with Matt, with the then Health Secretary, before he came over. So actually, I think my criticism about DHSC was that they didn't come to the meetings at senior official level at this time, but I think I was being unfair.
The issue of the DHSC was a perennial one,
yeah,
was it not?
I think particularly in the first lockdown, from the evidence that I've seen, there was real tensions.
But those problems persisted throughout the summer, because on the 3rd of June, with reference to the civil service, and I'm not going to name individual names, but with reference to civil service and the DHSC, you said of this particular person, he's hardly convincing senior ranks of government that the health system is on it. On the 29th of June, you referred to the failure on the part of the civil service side of the DHSC to drive the policy side of the operational lockdown on Mr. Hancock's behalf.
Yeah.
And you also, in a number of other WhatsApp messages, debated the need for Lord Sedwell to tell the Prime Minister to sack Mr. Hancock.
That's Lord Sedwell referring to his conversation or something. He was reporting that conversation to me. Yeah, so you're right.
I'm so sorry, Dr. Case.
Oh.
Please don't attempt to move away from your endorsement of his position, perhaps in French.
Oh, yeah, no, sorry. I
told the Prime Minister to sack Mr. Hancock and replace him with Gove. Simon Case, I think that's a great move.
Yeah. Sorry, it wasn't my suggestion. And I never discussed that, I don't think, with the Prime Minister. But on the important point on DHSC, actually, one of the things that pulling together the policy about local lockdowns, of course, is something that ended up inside the COVID task force and the test and trace operation. So those concerns were addressed.
Thank you.
Right, just as we're not sitting according to our normal pattern, I shall return at 2:05, sit till 3:10, take a 15-minute break, and then sit 3:25 to 4:30 or thereabouts. And we'll definitely finish your evidence today, Dr. Case.
All rise.